Welcome back to Endless Studio's video series on basic computer science concepts. In a previous video, we mentioned that programming languages use variables to represent and store pieces of information. A variable functions as a sort of container for storing a piece of information, known as a value, used by a program. Crucially, that value can change as the program runs. For example, the value of the player's score is meant to change as the game goes on and the player accumulates points. We can create a variable to hold the value of the player's score. Then, our code can refer to that variable by the name we give it, think of the name like a label on the container, and have access to or change whatever particular value the score happens to be at that point in time. If you're familiar with algebra, you know that variables in mathematics can represent any value. While this is also true for computer science variables, there are many important differences between them and algebraic variables. Unlike algebraic variables, variables in most programming languages can have names that are multiple characters long, not just like x or y. It's usually a good idea to name variables in a way that makes their purpose clear to anyone looking at your code. For example, you might name a variable that keeps track of the player's score, something obvious like player score. Preferred naming conventions, such as which parts of a variable name are capitalized, vary from one programming language to another, and even one game studio to another. In C#, the programming language used by Unity, variables typically start with a lowercase letter. If a variable name consists of multiple words, we smush the words together and capitalize the first letter of each word after the first. In many programming languages, including C#, a variable must also be declared before it is used. A declaration is a statement that creates the variable by assigning it a name and specifying its type. Once the program encounters a statement declaring the variable, we say that the variable has been initialized and is now ready for the program and the developer to use. I mentioned that to declare a variable, you have to specify its type. A variable's type is what kind of value the variable is intended to hold. Most programming languages, including C#, support a variety of basic variable types that correspond to the different kinds of information we frequently work with. Let's go over some of the most common simple variable types you will work with in game development. Game code often uses numbers and involves math, so there are numeric variable types to hold number values. In a game, a numeric type might be used to hold the player's score, the speed at which a vehicle is moving, or the number of units of damage a bullet will inflict if it hits the player. In C#, common numeric types include int, float, and double. Numeric types like these differ in how wide the range of different numbers they can hold is, and whether they allow decimal places or not. Ints, for example, can store a relatively narrow range of whole numbers, whereas floats hold a wider range of numbers and can include decimals. Because they can hold more information, floats take up more of the computer's memory than ints do. As a rule, programmers use the least memory-intensive type that accommodates their needs to maximize performance. Oh, by the way, that brings us to one other function of a variable declaration. When you declare a variable, you tell the computer to set aside the memory to hold the variable's value. Numbers aren't the only kind of information we need to work with when programming a game. Another very common kind of data is text. In a game, this might include the custom name of the player's character, the lengthy description of an inventory item, or the message that appears in a dialog box when a player talks to an NPC. Text types can include any kind of characters, letters, numbers, or symbols. One more important variable type is a bool, or Boolean value. Though technically a numeric type, the Boolean type is usually considered separately. A Boolean is used to represent things that can be only one value or another, like the on or off of a light switch. For Booleans, we express the two possible values as true and false. This plays a big role in conditional statements and loops, which we'll be discussing in another video. The Boolean type gets its name from George Boole, a mathematician from the 19th century who did pioneering work in logic that later became crucial to computer science. A great deal of code in games is concerned with variables, declaring them, getting information from them so it can be used later in code. For example, checking to see what the player's current score is. Changing their value, for example, adding 50 points to the value of the score variable when the player defeats an enemy, and so on. So, now that we've learned all about how variables work and we know some common types of variables, we can see how important they are in programming for games.